bonnet hit the boards and rolled into a wagon rut. A young woman pressed both hands to her face and turned away. Boot heels stamped on the porch to keep from laughing. Someone whistled low, the way men whistle at a stray dog. A drunk freighter held the bonnet up and waved it at the street. He shouted about the scar under her jaw, and the porch laughed. The young woman did not run. She bent and picked the bonnet from the dust. A horse came up the street at a slow walk. The man riding it looked only at her. He swung down without a word. He set a heavy flour sack on the freight scale outside the store. He took a small leather book from inside his coat. He opened it slowly. The porch did not yet know what was coming. Stay with me on this one. The man's name was Eben Halloran. He had not stepped foot in Silver Bell in nearly 11 years. He lived 7 miles up the timber on a homestead that did not show on any map the county kept. He came down once a year in late August for salt and shot and lamp oil. This year he had sent his daughter alone. He had hurt his knee on a deadfall and could not bear the saddle. He had told her to ride straight in by the list and ride straight out. He had not known the freighters were in town for the railroad survey. He had not known the porch would be full. He had not known any of it until a neighbor boy named Caleb rode up the trail at noon, half blowing his pony, and told him a girl with a scar was being held against the post outside Pemberton's store, and the men were not letting her go. Eben did not curse. He did not shout. He went to the barn. He saddled the gray mare. He put one box of cartridges in his coat pocket out of long habit, not out of plan. He took down the leather book from the shelf above the door. He had kept that book for 30 years. Every page was a name. Every name was a date. Every date was a quiet wrong he had watched the town do and never spoken of. He had told himself for 30 years that those names were not his to say. He had told himself a man minds his own ridge and lets the valley keep its own count. He closed the book. He put it inside his coat. He rode. Now here is the thing about Eben Halloran that the porch did not know. Before he ever came west, he had been a court clerk in St. Louis. He had sat through 300 trials in 8 years. He had written down every word a witness said. He had a memory the lawyers used to ask after by name. When he came west in the spring of '57, he did not put that memory down. He carried it up the ridge with him. Every man who passed through the valley below his cabin and did a thing worth remembering, he wrote it down. Not because he meant to use it. Because he did not know how to stop. Believe me, a man who has spent 8 years writing down what other men say under oath does not learn to forget. His daughter was called Ada. She was 23 years old. She had been mauled by a black bear at 9 and had carried a long scar from her jaw to the bone above her heart ever since. She did not speak of it. She wore a high collar and a soft voice and stayed close to the cabin. She had been to town twice in her life, and both times she had walked behind her father with her chin tucked. She had not told him she was going alone today. She had told herself she was a grown woman and the list was short. She had ridden in at 10 in the morning. By noon she had been on the porch of Pemberton's store with her bonnet on the ground and 6 men in a half circle, and she had not moved because her legs would not carry her past them. She had walked into Pemberton's store at 10:30. She had set her list on the counter. She had asked for 2 pounds of salt, a spool of black thread, a pound of coffee, and a tin of percussion caps. Pemberton had looked up from the ledger and looked at the scar before he looked at her eyes. He had told her the percussion caps were in the back. He had taken his time. When she came out onto the porch with the parcels in her arms, the freighters were on the steps. The first one stepped in front of her. The second one took her bonnet off her head, as if he were lifting a lid off a pot. He held it up. He said something about a face like that ought to be kept under a basket. The porch laughed. She turned to go back into the store. Pemberton had stepped into the doorway and crossed his arms. He had not moved aside. He had said, "You bought what you came for." The porch laughed harder. That was where she had been when Caleb, the neighbor boy, riding through with a load of mail, had seen her and turned his pony for the timber. Now you have to understand something about Silver Bell in 1887. It was not a violent town. It was a quiet town that had buried things. A mining strike had come and gone in the 70s and left behind a marshal who took bribes, a doctor who signed papers he should not have signed, a preacher who spent money meant for orphans, a saloon man who had run a girl into the snow on a lie, and a clerk behind the counter who had short-weighed a widow until she lost her homestead. The town did not know all of that. The town knew some of it and had agreed, without ever saying so out loud, to forget. Eben knew all of it. He had watched it from the ridge. He had written it down. He had not spoken. That was the agreement he had made with himself. Until today. Hold on to that detail. The town had not forgotten by accident. The town had forgotten on purpose. There is a difference. A town that forgets on purpose builds porches and puts loafers on them. A town that forgets on purpose makes a porch into a court of its own where men decide on a Wednesday morning who can be laughed at and who cannot. The porch of Pemberton's store had been that court for 30 years. The men on the porch did not know it was a court. They thought it was a place to spit and watch the street. But every wagon that rolled past was weighed by their eyes, the way Pemberton's flour was weighed on the scale inside. Eben Halloran had ridden past that porch twice a year for 3 decades and had felt it weighing him every time. Today his daughter had stepped onto the steps of it alone. Flat against the wood behind her. The drunk freighter had her bonnet on the end of his finger and was spinning it. Calhoun Briggs from the saloon was leaning on the rail. Pemberton, the clerk, was in the doorway with his arms folded. The marshal was across the street in his own doorway watching, thumbs in his belt. The doctor was on the steps with a tobacco pouch in his hand. The preacher was at the far end of the rail. Eben took all of this in without slowing the horse. He stopped the gray mare 10 feet short of the porch. He swung down. He led the mare to the freight scale and looped the rein. Ada saw him then. She did not call out. She did not move. She let out a single breath that fogged in the cold morning shadow of the porch, even though the day was warm. He looked at her once and gave her the smallest nod a man can give. Then he turned his back on her and faced the porch. He set his flour sack down on the iron plate of the freight scale. He took off his hat and set it on top of the sack. He reached inside his coat. He pulled out the small leather book. The freighter laughed and said something the porch did not quite catch. Eben opened the book to the first page. The laughter on the porch began to thin without any of them knowing why. Eben did not look up. He spoke at a normal volume, the way a man reads a list of supplies to a clerk. He said Bram Tilly. The freighter stopped spinning the bonnet. Eben said 1876. Wagon yard at Cottonwood Bend. You killed a teamster named Joseph Quinn over a dispute about a load of feed. You let a stable hand named Esteban Reyes hang for it. The court records list Reyes as the killer. I was on the bench that morning as clerk. I watched you lie under oath. The freighter's face went still. The bonnet slipped off his finger and landed in the dust beside Ada's foot. He started to say something. Eben did not lift his eyes from the book. He turned the page. He said Calhoun Briggs. Briggs straightened off the rail. Eben said 1879. A girl named Leila Beaumont worked the second floor of your place for one summer. She was carrying your brother's child. You told the town she had stolen the cash box. You ran her out into the November snow with one blanket and no horse. She walked as far as the line shack at 2 Mile Creek, and she died there. I buried her on the ridge above the shack on the 3rd of December. The marker is still there. You can ride out and read it. Briggs did not answer. He sat down on the rail like a man whose legs had gone soft. Eben turned the page. he said. Royce Pemberton. Pemberton in the doorway uncrossed his arms. Eben said, the winter of 1877. You short-weighed Marin coal on every 50-pound sack of flour she bought between October and March. She paid for 50 and carried out 41. By spring, she could not feed her 3 children on what was left of her stores. She sold the homestead to the bank in May. I have the ledger pages of freighter dropped on the trail. I have the weights in your own hand. The widow Cole is still in this town. She works at the bakery. She sleeps in a room above the kitchen. You walk past her every morning. Pemberton's mouth opened. No sound came out of it. The porch began to feel like a courtroom with no walls. Ada had not moved. She was still against the post. But her hands had come down from the wood and were folded in front of her now. She was looking at her father's back. She was breathing slowly, and her eyes were dry. Eben turned the page. He looked up for the first time. He looked at the doctor on the steps. He said, Holly's nettle. The doctor went pale around the mouth. Eben said, the spring of 1873, a miner named Pete Holloway was found dead at the Bluebird claim. You signed the certificate. You wrote heart failure. The man's own brother had brained him with a pick over the ownership of the lower drift. The brother paid you in raw silver out of that same claim. 22 ounces. I have the assay slip from the smelter in Leadville that lists the deposit in your name 3 days after the burial. The doctor said that is a lie. He said it quietly. Eben said, I have the slip in this book. I will read the number if you wish. The doctor did not wish. The doctor sat down on the step. Eben turned the page. The porch was quiet now. The boys with the hoop had stopped down the street. 2 women had come out of the milliner's shop and were standing in the doorway with their hands at their waists. A teamster on a load of barrels had pulled up his team and was watching from the seat. The wagon yard had emptied of voices. The whole of Silver Bell had gone still in a way it had not been still in 30 years. Eben Halloran kept reading. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He read the preacher's page. He read the marshal's page. He read 2 more names from the porch crowd that the porch had thought were just there to laugh. He read each one the way a man reads a bill of lading. Name, year, place, crime. He gave the small details that proved he had been there or had paper that placed him there. He named a freighter who had drowned the dog of a homesteader's child to settle a fence dispute. He named a hand at the livery who had stolen a saddle off a dying rider and sold it back to the man's widow. He named 11 men in all. He did not name any man twice. He did not name any man without proof. When he had read the 11th page, he closed the book. He put the book back inside his coat. He picked up his hat. He set it back on his head. He did not look at the porch. He turned to his daughter. He held out his hand. Ada stepped away from the post and walked the 4 steps to him and put her hand in his. He bent down and picked up her bonnet out of the dust. He shook it once. He gave it to her. He said, we should get the salt and the thread and go home. She nodded. She walked into the store ahead of him. Pemberton stood aside. He did not say anything. He did not meet her eyes. The store was dim and cool. Ada took down what she needed. She put it on the counter. Pemberton wrote the slip with a hand that was not steady. Eben paid in coin. He carried the goods out himself. He set the parcels in the saddlebags. He helped Ada up onto her pony. He picked up his flour sack from the freight scale. He did not look at the porch. The blacksmith's wife had come across the street with a tin cup of water. She handed it to Eben. He thanked her by name. He drank the cup down in one long swallow. He gave her the cup back. He wiped his mouth on the back of his wrist. He wiped the dust off the leather of the book through his coat without taking it back out. He sat down on the corner of the freight scale for a moment to set his hurt knee. The porch did not move. The street did not move. The blacksmith's wife stood beside him with the empty cup and did not move. It was the kind of quiet that comes once in a town's life and does not come again. Then the door of the store opened behind him. Royce Pemberton stepped out onto the porch with a length of hickory in his hand. He said, "Get on that horse and get your scarred girl out of my town, and do not come back." Eben Halloran opened the book. He did not stand up to do it. He did not turn fully around. He simply opened the book to a page near the back that he had not read yet. He said, "Royce Pemberton." Pemberton stopped on the second step with the hickory still raised. Eben said, "The second page is not the only page I keep on you." The summer of 1884. Eben read 3 more lines. He read them in the same flat voice he had used the first time. The porch heard every word. The men who had thought their pages were closed felt them open again. Pemberton lowered the hickory. He did not lower it because Eben had threatened him. He lowered it because he had heard his own younger brother's name come out of the book. His brother had died in Cheyenne in the winter of '85, and the town had been told it was pneumonia. The book said otherwise. Pemberton sat down on the step with the hickory across his knees and put his face in his hand. If you are still with me right here, hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want the rest of these stories about men who never raised a hand and still made a whole town go quiet. Now back to the porch. Eben stood up from the scale. He put his weight slowly on the hurt knee and let it settle. He walked to the gray mare. He did not put the book away. He held it loose at his side. He spoke to the porch then, the only time he spoke to the porch as a porch. He said, "I have lived 7 miles up that ridge for 30 years. I have come down twice a year, and I have not spoken a word of any of this. I told myself it was not my country to clean. I told myself a town has the right to forget what it wants to forget. I told myself my daughter would never have to walk past any of you. That was the agreement I made with myself. That agreement is finished." He paused. He did not raise his voice for what came next. He said, "You laughed at my daughter." The porch did not answer. The town did not answer. A wagon bell rang once at the far end of the street, and nobody turned to look. Eben said, "Here is what happens now. The book stays with me. The book has copies. The copies are with 3 people in 2 counties, and none of them are in this town. If any harm comes to my daughter, or to me, or to the widow Cole at the bakery, or to the Ray's family in San Luis, or to the Hadley girl who lives in Pueblo now, the copies are read in the courthouse at Del Norte on the next sitting day." He looked up. He looked once at the marshal across the street. The marshal did not meet his eye. Eben said, "You all know which pages are yours. You can each decide what to do with them. That is between you and the page." He closed the book. He put it back inside his coat. He turned to Ada. He said, "Ready?" She nodded. He swung up onto the gray mare slowly because of the knee. He clicked his tongue. The mare stepped off. Ada's pony followed. They walked the length of the main street side by side. They did not look back. The 2 women in the milliner's doorway watched them go. The teamster on the barrel load took his hat off and held it across his chest as they passed. The boys with the hoop stood still and let it lie in the dust. The porch did not get up. The porch did not laugh. The porch sat where it sat and looked at its own hands. The sun was high and white, and the dust did not lift. Silver Bell was the quietest it had been since the strike of '71. They reached the edge of town. They turned onto the timber road. The town fell behind them like a held breath being let out. They rode home at a walk. They did not speak for the first hour. The ponies moved easy. The shadows from the lodgepole pines crossed the road in long, thin bars. At a place where the road forked off toward an old line shack, Ada pulled up. She unbuttoned the top button of her high collar. Then she unbuttoned the second button. Then the third. She let the collar fall open. The scar that ran from her jaw to the bone above her heart caught the late sun. She did not cover it. She looked at her father. She said, "You knew all of those things." He said, "Yes." She said, "For how long?" He said, "The oldest one is from before you were born." She said, "And you never told." He said, "No." She said, "Why today?" He said, "Because today they put their hands on you." He said, "That was the line." He said, "I did not know where the line was until they crossed it." She nodded once. She rode on. He rode beside her. They came up the last switchback to the homestead at dusk. The dog came down the trail to meet them. Ada slid off her pony and put her arms around the dog's neck for a long moment. Eben sat on the gray mare and watched her. His hurt knee was throbbing. His hand on the saddle horn was steady. He felt no triumph. He felt the same thing he had felt on the porch. He felt that a long debt had been paid not by him but through him, and that he had been carrying it on his back for 30 years without knowing how heavy it was until he set it down. He swung off the mare. He put the gray in the corral. He carried the parcels into the cabin himself. He set the leather book on the shelf above the door where it had always lived. 2 men were gone from Silver Bell by morning. Calhoun Briggs left on the 4 a.m. freight to Pueblo and did not send for his things. Bram Tilley rode south at first light and was last seen crossing into New Mexico. The marshal turned in his star to the county at the end of the week and moved to a sister's place in Kansas without giving a reason. The doctor stayed but did not practice past the autumn. The preacher gave a sermon the following Sunday about restitution and afterward walked to the bakery and sat down across from the widow Cole and put a folded paper in front of her and did not lift his eyes. Nobody knew what was on the paper. The widow read it and folded it again and put it in her apron and went back to her bread. The next month she bought the bakery outright. Nobody asked how. Royce Pemberton kept the store. He hired a new clerk. He stopped sitting on the porch. The porch loafers found other porches. The porch itself sagged a little in the next winter and never was repaired. The town went on. It went on a little quieter. Children grew up in Silver Bell hearing the story in pieces and never the whole. The whole was in the book. The book stayed on a shelf 7 miles up the timber. Stories came back to the homestead over the years through neighbors and freighters. A teacher in town began a habit of reading the names of dead Ute children at the school assembly each fall, names the marshal had kept off the county rolls in '81. A new doctor was sent for from Pueblo, and the town paid his way out by subscription. The Hadley girl, who had been 5 when her brother died in the Denver bunk, came back to Silver Bell at 22 and bought a small lot on the south end of town and set up a millinery. The preacher kept his church for 2 more years, and then asked the bishop for a transfer to a mission in the territory. The bishop, who had read certain pages by then through means nobody at the church understood, did not grant the transfer. The preacher served out the rest of his days in Silver Bell at half pay, and was buried under a flat stone that gave only his name and his years. Ada came down to Silver Bell 6 more times in her father's lifetime. She did not wear the high collar after that first day. She walked into Pemberton's store with her chin up. Pemberton sold her what she asked for at the honest weight. He did not speak more than was needed. Once, on her 4th visit, the widow Cole came across the street with a fresh loaf wrapped in cloth and pressed it into her hands, and held her hands a moment longer than was required and walked back without a word. Ada carried the loaf home in her saddlebag and did not eat it for 2 days because she did not want it to be gone. Eben Halloran lived another 14 years. He died in his sleep in the cabin in the winter of 1901. Ada buried him on the ridge above the homestead next to the unmarked grave of Leila Beaumont, which he attended every summer of her life, and which Ada had not known the name of until that day on the porch. Ada lived on at the homestead until 1923. The leather book stayed on the shelf above the door. After she was gone, a grandson of the widow Cole rode up the trail and brought the book down. He gave it to the county clerk at Del Norte. The clerk read it once, sealed it in oilcloth, and put it in the courthouse vault where it still sits. The widow Cole lived to be 81. She ran the bakery in Silver Bell for the rest of her life and trained 2 of her grandchildren in the trade. She never spoke of what was on the paper the preacher gave her on the bakery counter. When she died, A clerk going through her tin box found a bank draft dated October of '87 for the value of the homestead she had lost in '77, plus 10 years of interest at frontier rates, signed at the bottom in two hands. One was the preacher's. The other was Royce Pemberton's. The two of them had walked into the bank together the morning after the porch, and had drawn the draft and had brought it to her. She had cashed half of it for the bakery. The other half she had kept folded in the tin box for 46 years. The clerk who found it gave it to her oldest grandson. He framed it. It hangs in the bakery to this day next to a picture of his grandmother in a flour-dusted apron, and nobody who walks in and orders a loaf ever asks what the framed paper is. The Ray's family in San Luis was found by a Del Norte lawyer in the spring of '88. He carried with him a sworn statement signed by Eben Halloran and notarized by the county. The statement set out exactly what had happened at the Cottonwood Bend wagon yard in '76. Esteban Reyes had been 21 when he hanged. His mother was still alive. She was 64. She read the statement through twice. She handed it back to the lawyer. She said, "My son is still dead." The lawyer said, "Yes." She said, "But my son is not a killer anymore." The lawyer said, "No." She wept once. She crossed herself. She put a photograph of Esteban on the wall of her parlor, where she had not been able to bear to put it for 12 years. The territory issued a posthumous pardon the following autumn. The pardon hung beside the photograph until her own death in 1904. The line of words Eben Halloran read on the porch of Pemberton's store on a hot August afternoon in 1887 was not a threat. It was not vengeance. It was a public ledger spoken into the dust. It cost no one their life. It took no one's land. It drew no weapon. It only put names back next to deeds the town had agreed to forget. That was all. It was enough. A father stood between his daughter and a porch full of laughing men, and he did it with a small book and a steady voice. The town went silent. The silence was the verdict. And the daughter, the next time she rode in with her collar open and her chin up, the way a free person rides into a town that has remembered at last who it is supposed to be.